According to research from Pew and YouGov, a significant majority of Americans say that wealth inequality in the United States is a problem. But only about 40% of Americans think that the federal government should prioritize addressing inequality. Americans tell researchers, billionaires are bad, but I care about the cost of healthcare, food, housing. Why should I care about billionaires? In his book, Burned by Billionaires, author Chuck Collins outlines 7 specific reasons why he thinks Americans should care. And on this week's Afterwards, he talks through those reasons, from private jet emissions to mobile home parks to private equity-owned hospitals. Chuck Collins is the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, and in 1985, he gave away his entire inheritance. He's the author of 7 other books, and he now works as a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Author Chuck Collins, coming up on Afterwards. This is Afterwards from C-SPAN. This week, Chuck Collins talks about his book, Burned by Billionaires, how concentrated wealth and power are ruining our lives and planet. He sat down with journalist and fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, Sam Pizzigatti, in Washington, D.C. in November of 2025.
So, Chuck, let me start with a simple question. When did you, as a young person in a very wealthy family, when did you first realize that in our U.S. of A., some people had fantastically much more money than other people?
I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and actually 2 of my high school classmates are here, Natalie and Beverly, right here. They can tell you about the bubble where I grew up, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. But when I was 7 is 1967, which was a formative event in the life of the city of Detroit, the uprising, what people call the riots. And I think it was like, even though I was 7, it was like a little bit of a all is not well with the world moment. You know, my little childhood bubble was pierced by that. What's going on? And the newspaper would come and I would comb through those pictures and pester my mother, what's going on, what's going on? But at the core, I think I knew it had to do with the divide, the city and the suburb, black and white in that context, rich and poor. And that planted a little seed that has probably percolated over the years. So
yes, and that little seed of inequality back then has grown into a gigantic chasm today. So let's talk a little bit about what today is like. Chuck, to you, who rates as really wealthy in the United States?
One of the things I tried to do in this book is say, well, when people say who's wealthy, well, what do we mean by that? And when does wealth become harmful to the wider society? And so I borrowed from journalist Robert Frank, who wrote a book called Richistan, and wrote a section called The Roadmap to Richistan. So I tried to take you on a journey. There's the top 10% affluentville, there's billionaireville at the other end, and we know obviously the billionaires are a huge, obviously that's where tremendous wealth and power resides. I looked this morning, I think there's 920 US billionaires whose combined wealth is about $8 trillion, up from $3 trillion before the pandemic. So that's a pretty big updraft of wealth in a short time. But then if you look at through the other villages of Richistan, obviously there's a lot of different levels of consumption and wealth, and the top 1%, we heard that conversation. Where I came down is that at around the $30–40 million mark, wealth starts to translate into power. It's not to say that people with $30 million don't have a lot of power. They have a lot of agency. They have a sense of control over their lives. They may have multiple homes. But when you start to get to 40 million and up to the billionaire class, you're not just buying another house or a yacht. You're buying a senator and a media outlet, and you're warping and distorting the public commons. And so that's that 1/10 of 1%. And that's where, if we're going to kind of address or put pressure points on how do we rewire the economy or how do we fix this, we need to look at that 1/10 of 1%, the top 1/1000th of households, and look at policies that reverse and reduce that concentration of wealth and power. So there's more about that in the book, but that talks about the different segments of what we mean by wealthy.
Chuck, in the book, you also talk about the geography of the super rich. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, that is in a sense the geography, and there are places where that top 1/10 of 1% lands, touches down, owns real estate, owns property. But yeah, that was sort of the roadmap to Richistan is a sense a geography as well as a power analysis.
Chuck, a lot of us who write and think about inequality talk about, dream about a United States without billionaires, talk about abolishing billionaires. You take a slightly different take when you talk about billionaires. Can you address that?
Well, I mean, you've probably heard this, there's sort of when you talk about a world without billionaires or abolishing billionaires, there's a little like whiff of exterminism. And so language to me matters. So I like to say I like to kind of take it off the individual. I mean, there's obviously individuals, and I tell stories of individuals about their behavior. And there are obviously some billionaires that are obviously very badly behaved. That said, we're talking about a system. And the fundamental concern to me is how the economy has been rigged or changed to funnel wealth to that top 1/1000th. And that's what we should be focusing on. So it's less about the behavior of individuals, although that, I come from that perspective, like we're all individually responsible for our behavior, but then we also, there is a system at work here. So I would say we need fewer billionaires and more thousandaires. When you have 40% of households that have no financial reserves, our economy and society would be so much better off with more thousandaires and fewer billionaires. And there are societies around the world, robust capitalist societies, that have, don't have a third of the world's billionaires like the United States. There's something unique here. I actually really liked Billie Eilish, her little moment there. Here's this, 23-year-old performer getting this big award. She's got a bunch of billionaires in the room. And to quote her literally, she says, "If you're a billionaire, why are you a billionaire? No hate." And I like that, no hate, but give your money away, shorties. I had to look up that shorties thing reference, but I think that basic message of like, how much is enough? This is not about your consumption. This is not about legacy. Maybe it's a little bit about immortality and legacy. It's not about taking care of your children. Your children are set. It's about power. And if you're sitting on that level of wealth in a suffering world, why are you a billionaire? And I think that was a prophetic moment in pop culture.
Chuck, you've titled your book, Burned by Billionaires. How about some examples of the burning that you see out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think my hope is that you will come away reading this book with, and many of you, I'm sure, are quite conversant in the harms of billionaires. In fact, I had a very short-lived congressional intern career with Barney Frank. And the reason I didn't last long is he would come into the room and, I'd be ready with my little presentation on some housing bill, and he'd just say, "Tell me something I don't know," in a kind of Bayonne, New Jersey accent. And of course, I didn't have anything that he didn't know. So, I was out of a job. So you're probably thinking, a democracy's been hijacked from billionaires. Tell me something I don't know, But my modest hope is that for a wider reader audience, and we co-edit a newsletter called inequality.org, so we get a lot of fan mail, as you can imagine. And some of that is very much along the line of, no billionaire has done anything that's harmed me, that kind of thing. So, I think part of understanding the lens is in this moment in particular, and when I say billionaires, I'm talking about that top 1/10 of 1%, that the billionaires, our lives are being disrupted in ways that are still unfolding. But there's some really obvious ones. And I have a long list, and you can read the book, but a couple that are on our minds. Health. The concentration of wealth is disrupting our healthcare system, and there's a segment of the kind of billionaire-backed private equity funds that are extracting wealth from the healthcare system aggressively, using their wealth and power to hoover up wealth and squeeze consumers and squeeze workers in the healthcare industry. Housing. I would say that these extreme inequalities are supercharging the existing housing crisis. We have challenges in our communities around housing, but the level of extreme impact that wealth, and in cities like Washington, D.C. and New York and others, you see these luxury housing booms that are building these huge towers and luxury housing, not for people to live in, but essentially as a sort of safe deposit box, a way to hold wealth. And then that doesn't even include, again, billionaire-backed private equity funds, the big 30 private equity funds, moving into buying up single-family housing because they know people like our kids are not going to be able to own a home of their own. And so they're going to be, but they might want to live in a single-family house with a yard. So the private equity investors understand that's a market niche. Jeff Bezos has invested in a big fund that's just buying up single-family houses, rental housing, converting to short-term rentals, mobile home parks. Some of you know I got my organizing start in my early 20s, helping organize mobile home park tenants to buy their parks as resident-owned co-ops. And I work with Greg Graham here and working on community land trusts and mobile home cooperatives. There's one of the mobile home investors who said, I love buying up mobile home parks. This is a big, billionaire investor. It's like buying a Waffle House where the customers are chained to the booths. And again, there's a pattern here, which is where are you going to earn, if you're a wealthy investor, where are you going to get those 25% returns on investment? Putting it in that bank account with that little return isn't going to satisfy that desire. So, how do we get those levels? And, buying up mobile home parks, those folks have nowhere to go. We can squeeze them as hard as we can, and they are. The environment, don't get me going, but, we talk more in detail, but the billionaires are trashing the environment, delaying the ability of our society to respond to the climate crisis, running out the clock, using their wealth and power to block alternatives. So those are just a few, and in the book I try to identify 15 or 20, but even in the time since I've been out talking to people, I keep hearing other ones that I'll relay along, but those are a few.
Chuck, you started that list talking about health and the impact on health. Do you ever daydream about what would happen if the majority of the American people understood what scientists have been telling us over the past 20 years? That is that inequality itself, the fact of the gap, is unhealthy, causes ill health. Do you ever daydream about
I do, that? And I think it's one of the things that we should talk about more. And we have friends Stephen Bezruka and Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, people who've been writing sort of about how unequal societies with grotesque imbalances of wealth are unhealthy for everybody, even affluent households. So to understand that inequality is a public health issue, I think is an understanding that we're still not fully taking in. That, and I think about this all the time because I've lived in Boston where the Carney Hospital, which was owned by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston, sold to a private equity investor who then created Steward Healthcare and bought up 10 other hospitals and then just squeezed them to the point where they were almost bankrupt. And we're seeing that all over the country, so that, the healthcare economy, sixth of the economy is disrupted by the predatory investors. But yeah, I think if I were going to summarize it simply, it's like our health, when you have extreme inequality, there is a breakdown in the solidarity that we need, that sense of that we're in the same boat. There's a breakdown in that. And I think the pandemic taught us something about that and how our society failed to respond. There's heroic ways in which people responded, but there were all these ways we failed to respond that I think were rooted in the fact that we're such a divided, polarized society economically.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to Chuck Collins. He's the author of Burned by Billionaires.
Let me switch to the environment for a second, but let me tell a little story first. Back in 1955, when I was a little kid, the most famous song in the country, the biggest pop hit, #1 on all the charts, was 16 Tons. And some of you may remember that. And the chorus went something like 16, I won't sing it, I'll just say it. I'll
Sing it, Sam, sing it.
No, I'll spare people that. 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. That was a coal miner's lament. 16 tons today is the amount of emissions, carbon emissions, that the average American emits. How much does the average billionaire emit?
Well, thanks to a recent Oxfam study, the top 1/10 of 1% that I'm focused on here emit about 2.2 tons per day.
Per day.
Per day. So the level of impact is much greater. And to me, there's three things that I'll just real quickly say about billionaires' environment. One is these are the super emitters. So I think there's an important thing, which is we're all responsible, particularly those of us who live in the global north, who've benefited from a century of fossil fuel burning and infrastructure. We're all responsible for this moment, particularly from a global equity point of view. So yet, the billionaires are the super emitters. More houses, flying private jets. We did a little mini campaign that I think touched a nerve, which was during the FAA, canceling flights. We called for the grounding of private jets. Ground the private jets before somebody can't get home to see their grandmother. Come on, folks. Larry Ellison's yacht, 7,000 tons of carbon emissions a year. And that doesn't count the island he owns in Hawaii and the jets that travel he's using. So the ultra-rich are the super emitters. Secondly, there's a segment of the fossil fuel oligarchs, if you will, like the big coal and gas and oil, who use their wealth, power, and position to really block alternatives. And they're reaping the benefits now of investing in the current president, getting him elected, and now we're literally shutting down wind projects and keeping open zombie coal plants that were scheduled to be closed. But I think the biggest harm is that, again, back to that breakdown in solidarity. Sam, he says, I'm gonna walk or bike today down to Hyattville Center. I'm not gonna drive. And then you read Kylie Jenner just flies their jet across town for lunch. And you're like, we're all being played as chumps. And to pull together, and we are gonna need to pull together to face a disrupted future, we're gonna need a sense of solidarity, and we're all in this together. And we look to our neighbors. Are you taking the step? Am I taking the step? And then we look over here, and here are the billionaires, and they're laughing on their way to their private island, So the billionaires are going to have to change their behavior the most, and I think they should change their behavior first. And I think there's ways we should do that. We can push for that.
Well, speaking of ways we can push to do that, let me put you on the spot. If you had to choose between outlawing private luxury jets and private luxury super yachts, what would you choose?
Oh man, I did just show this to Sam. I brought a centimillionaire friend of mine gave me her brochure on private jet excursions. You can remember in the old days when people went on cruises, you know, around the world in boats to see the great. Well, this is a private jet cruises. For $205,000 a person, you could take a private jet cruise. So, you know, on the one hand, we know that yachts are the most polluting form of transportation, and nobody really needs a yacht. Some people might need a private jet for an air ambulance, or they have to get somewhere, you know, whatever. I guess I think, and I've been working a lot on place-based campaigns to stop private jet expansion and reform private jets. I think from a social movement point of view, I think there are these place-based fights, as like in New England, there's a Hanscom Field, which is a airport that's entirely private jets. There's a proposal to triple the hangar space. Turns out, this may break your heart, there are a lot of unsheltered private jets out there. Nowhere to go. And so they need homes. And so there's a huge infrastructure investments at all these airports, and they're not at the big airports with a lot of commercial traffic. They tend to be these smaller airports. Well, to me, and Warren Buffett named his private jet the Indefensible, which I think is a good name for a private jet. Private jet travel is indefensible on a warming planet. You know, in IPS, we have done all these reports on this. We've looked into this. So I actually think from a movement point of view, I think focusing on dialing down, regulating, levying fuel taxes on private jets, partly because none of us, you know, it's very rare to experience what is these yachts. You can see pictures of them and that sort of thing. Whereas private jets, we can see them. And they're cutting in line at the airport when you're sitting and waiting on the tarmac. You know, so there's, I think, a populist moment issue there. So I support the
Private jets.
Yeah, I wouldn't say initially dial back no new private jet infrastructure, just like no new fossil fuel infrastructure, and then no short hop flights. You know, in Boston, half the flights are going to like Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, West Palm Beach. You know, it's like if there's other transportation alternatives, no private jets. You know, that's sort of my.
Yeah. So you mentioned housing a little bit ago when you were talking about what's in the book. And that reminded me of an incredible, your book is full of wonderful statistics, but this statistic really struck home with a lot of power. You wrote that in Los Angeles, one recent study found 36,000 unhoused families in Los Angeles. At the same time, Los Angeles has 41,000 vacant residences that are not even up for sale. So you've got the 36,000 unhoused families and 41,000 vacant residences just sitting there. Nobody trying to put somebody in them. How does something like that happen? I mean, that's just.
Yeah. I think to amplify on the housing crisis, and I ask you to kind of get into your inner billionaire for a moment. You have so much wealth. What do you do with it? You know, and even if you have a little bit, you know, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. As a chicken farmer, I can attest all the times I've dropped a basket. Anyway, so here's, you know, so if you have $1 billion or like the 26 guys who have 50 billion or more now, that's where we're at in the US. Where do you park it? You know, so some of it's in financial investments, and you know, you go to your investment advisor and they say, I've got some private equity investments over here, but you only are putting a third of your wealth into those high risk, high speculative investments. And your real estate, land, real property is an important place to park money. And so that's why Why is it Bill Gates is the largest owner of farmland in the United States? It's not because he's interested in farming. It's because he has so much wealth, he needs to spread it around. So real estate spread around to lots of different markets in different countries is a way to diversify those wealth holdings. And that's where you have a situation where people are buying luxury properties in Los Angeles, but not living in them. There's a couple of campaigns, though. People are working tax vacant properties, you know, not if you're renovating it, and if you're actually living in it, but you know, the Vancouver and British Columbia has an empty homes tax luxury real estate transfers. We're seeing that in a number of jurisdictions. You know, property sells for $2 million or $5 million or higher, you tax it, and that money goes into a fund for permanently affordable housing. So, you know, kind of like the poison ivy growing next to the jewel weed, the solution is right there. You get the poison ivy, you rub the jewel weed on it. The remedy is there. We tax the excess luxury property to fund real, healthy, affordable housing.
So let's stay on taxes for a moment. I think everybody here knows, realizes, understands that we all pay local taxes, we all pay state taxes, we all pay federal taxes. But in the book, you make a point that we pay another sort of tax as well. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think, I mean, we're paying huge taxes to private corporations and these private equity funds, and we should talk about them as taxes. There are ways in which we're being squeezed. But I think the thing I try to do in this book, and there's a lot of tax expertise in the room here, but is to talk about what happens when you shift tax responsibilities off the wealthy onto working people, off of wealth and inherited wealth and onto wages, off of corporations that used to pay a third of the revenue and now pay less than 10%, off of federal, the progressive tax code, the federal tax code still is more progressive, and onto state and local. And being a Vermonter, you know, I'm constantly sitting with people who are complaining about local property taxes and local taxes. And who are they mad at? They're mad at their city council or their town select board. And what we don't see is that this is what happens when for 40 years you shift. And lo and behold, here we are at the local level, low and middle income people, working people are picking up the slack for the taxes that the wealthy aren't paying. You know, I come from Vermont, so you know my senior senator kind of harps on these points sometimes. But one of my favorite quotes is, he says, "Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the richest 1% paid 90% of their income in taxes, and we invested in debt-free higher education, affordable housing and home ownership, infrastructure that lifted up the middle class." Right, so you get the. But that point that in the 50s, yeah, right. Hopefully he isn't watching this on C-SPAN in the middle of the night with insomnia. But anyway, you know, the point is we had a tax code where we taxed wealth, and we even shared it with states and localities. The federal government sent money to states and localities to solve problems. Now our states and localities are trying to figure it out on their own. So that formula, taxing wealth, investing in things that make a difference in people's lives, is the way forward, one of the ways forward.
So speaking of your senator from Vermont, we have in the audience today one of the people who planned the welcome for Bernie when he was first to Washington, when he was first elected, Paul Pinsky over there. So,
a great former senator from the state of Maryland.
Yes, yes. Let's switch to charities for a moment. Rich people, extremely rich people, love to talk about charities because they know Americans appreciate charitable giving. Americans believe that charities do a lot of good. Who do you think benefits the most from the charitable structure that we have in the United States right now?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a longer discussion, and it's an area where at the Institute for Policy Studies, we have a whole project looking at charity reform. In fact, my coworker, Bella Devon, is here. Bella is the coordinator of that. So maybe I should hand the mic to her, but in a nutshell, what's happened as wealth is concentrated in fewer hands, philanthropies become more top-heavy, and that affects the nonprofit sector. What gets funded, what doesn't get funded, and so we've seen this. And with changes in the tax code and growing inequality, the biggest beneficiaries of the charitable deduction basically is summarized as the wealthier you are, the bigger the charitable deduction you get. So here's one little fact. If for every dollar that a billionaire gives to charity, we as taxpayers chip in 74 cents, up to 74 cents in lost revenue. So what we're basically doing is we as taxpayers are subsidizing the private power of billionaires. Because if you have $1 billion, and I should say, I worked with Bill Gates' dad, who was a very, very amazing guy. And he used to say, isn't it a little odd that my son, Bill Jr., Trey, we call him, gave $100 billion of Microsoft wealth to his foundation and will never have to pay taxes on the appreciation of that wealth? So wealthy people get to opt out of paying their taxes by creating a charitable foundation or an intermediary of some kind. And, our concern is, first of all, taxes is not a substitute for a fair and progressive tax system. Wealthy people should not have the ability to opt out and then create the Chuck Collins Fund, and for my unborn great-grandchildren will still be around deciding what to do with this money that I got a tax break for in 2025 or whatever. So we need to rewire the rules governing charity, and we're sort of out there pushing for that because, and some of you work in the nonprofit sector, even a generation 20, 40 years ago, people used to talk about the 80-20 rule. You raised 80% of your money from 20% of your donors, which meant that you didn't forget about your small donor base. But what happens when it becomes the 99-1 rule, where you're raising 99% of your operating budget? You think of you as a university president today, and the leverage that a small number of donors have over these institutions. How can that possibly be good? So reversing that top-heavy impact in the charity sector is worrisome, I think, and necessary. Yeah.
Chuck, you've been working, you've been working on inequality all your adult life. While you were researching this book, did you come across anything that surprised you?
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't know going into this book was how the billionaires are coming for your pets. Now, many people in our society, their animals are members of their family, and the billionaire-backed private equity investors have discovered that people are willing to go into debt for healthcare procedures for their animals or for just basic care or so they have a good life. So they've moved into this part of the economy. A third of veterinary clinics are now owned by these private equity funds. If you have animals, people are paying more for veterinary care. And if you've bought your cat food or dog food recently, the cost keeps going up. And it's a whole area where there's a squeeze going on. And I was really brought to my attention by my friend Kay, who's a dog walker, who said, I've found some clients on rover.com, but they take a big bite out of my fees. And I'm looking into this and I'm like, wow, so I want Jim Lardner, he wants to hire me to walk his dog. I've met his dogs over the years. And so he hires me through rover.com. Rover.com takes a piece of my work. Guess who just bought rover.com? Blackstone, this $1 trillion private equity fund. So who's the biggest owner of veterinary care and pet food in the country? The Mars family, a dynastically wealthy family that we think of associated with candy. So watch every part of your budget, if you will, to see this encroachment. It's a form of taxation. We're having to, costs, we're talking about affordability, but look at what's driving up the cost of food in the food economy. These huge conglomerates like JBS that controls the beef market. So anyway, and then as I do these events, a friend of mine, Chris, came up to me who happens to be in a wheelchair and says, oh, there's two big wheelchair companies that dominate the market and dictate the terms and costs. And you have to pay them. So there's ways in which I think I'm still discovering new ways we're getting burned by billionaires in every corner of our expenditures.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to Chuck Collins. He's the author of Burned by Billionaires.
Chuck, let me switch back to your personal life a little bit. When you were a young man, you inherited quite a bit of money, and you chose to spread the wealth rather than to enjoy it. You chose to give all that wealth away. Do you have any sense about young people who are in the position today that you were in back 30 plus years ago? Do you think that young people today in that position are more or less likely to adopt the route that you took?
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know, my great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer, which is why that Wienermobile is taking up 3 parking places out here. And my father, my late father, who used to say, bringing home the bacon had a different meaning in our family. But so yeah, I did not think inherited wealth was a good thing for society or for me as an individual in my mid-20s. Now, I thought Sam was going to say, do you have any regrets, which people always ask me. You can talk to our children about that. But, here's the good news. And this is not, there are huge cracks in the system within the wealth holders, within the wealth holding classes. So there's a whole generation of younger people. There's a network called Resource Generation, people under 35, are very explicitly talking about redistribution of wealth and power and land, and reparations and repair. And there's wealth advisors, people who help the rich hide their money. And I have this other book called The Wealth Hoarders I wrote, which I only wish I'd called it How to Hide $1 Billion, because it might have sold more or something. Right? But there's a whole industry of tax advisors and wealth managers and accountants who help the super rich play shell games and create trusts and move money offshore and onshore and all that sort of stuff. Well, there's defectors, major defectors from that sector. How do we know about all the hidden wealth in the world? Most of it from leaks, from people working inside that industry. If any of you are wealth managers helping billionaires hide their money, I'm happy to talk to you after the program and connect you with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. But that to say, there are cracks there. And there's one wealth advisor who I love who's in England who says, my job is to help you redistribute your wealth. If you have 50 million, I can help you get it to 10. And we can do it in a way that heals the harms caused by the original extraction of the wealth. And that's, to me, very encouraging and hopeful. So I'm not saying wait around for there to be a change of the heart at the top, but there are some allies and potential allies in that wealth holding sector. I'm here for this week, the meetings of the Patriotic Millionaires, so 300 members coming together who are out there basically saying, tax us more, and advocating for a robust estate tax, which my friend Jeff Ricchetti is an advocate of. And people like, we have to tax and slow that accretion of dynastic wealth at the top, and having a robust estate inheritance tax would do that, as well as dealing with income and wealth disparities. But that would, if we had a robust inheritance tax as we did, a century ago and during the 30s, one generation later, we will have dramatically shifted this problem.
Chuck, on solutions and taxes, one of the things you talk about in the book is the need for what you call game-changing campaigns that link the affordability crisis to how we tax billionaires. How do we make that link?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, affordability is the word of the day, but let's link solutions to the affordability crisis to the billionaire problem. A, B, C, affordability, the billionaires, and care, the care society, care economy. That to me is a program, and I see these campaigns that link, kind of going back to what Senator Sanders said. We taxed the wealthy and we invested in things that created a social safety net and created opportunity for non-wealthy people. So the incoming mayor of New York says we're going to tax millionaire incomes in New York City and hopefully at the state level, and we're going to put money into free childcare and infrastructure and bus transit and things that are going to make a huge difference in people's lives. Tax private jet fuel, fund green infrastructure at the ground level. Tax luxury housing, fund affordable housing. The California initiative that's going to be on the ballot next year, an emergency wealth tax on the billionaires of California to fund the healthcare cost gap of people who've lost their Medicaid support. So those are those game-changing campaigns. Find things that people care about, are willing to fight for, link the revenue to that. Bill Gates Sr. used to say his idea was tax inherited wealth through a robust estate tax, fund debt-free education for anybody who wants to do 2 years of national service, military or community service, and watch the impact of that. Reweave the social fabric. People have a sense of connection to society and government. Reduce the concentration of wealth and power, and make education free and available to everybody. Higher education or job training of whatever they want. So, should we shift to open? I don't know if you had any final.
No, let's shift to
yeah. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. And here's one right here.
Hi. The period of extreme growth and inequality in this country from 1980 to now roughly coincides with the bipartisan consensus that antitrust law was unnecessary. And I'm wondering to what degree do you see in today's billionaires monopoly or oligopoly power?
Yeah, one of the things actually in an earlier section of the book I write about the great age-old question: how do we become wealthy? How does somebody become wealthy? And there's the sort of the narrative of, Jim invents a better mousetrap. We all want to buy his new mousetrap, and so we pay him and reward him, and you become an entrepreneur. But then there's the stage of that wealth accumulation where you kind of are like, hey, Sam is inventing a mousetrap down the road. How do I make sure that Sam's mousetrap isn't going to compete with mine? You start to use your wealth and power to block alternatives. Or if you look at the story of Bill Gates, you start to buy up other companies, or you block patents, or you intervene. So there's this stage of wealth and power where people defend their wealth by blocking competition and then capturing the political system to fend off regulation onto what I would call, we're in the hyper-extractive stage. So to me, there's the stage of wealth and power which is about monopoly, is about investing in consolidation and monopoly. And I think, as you say, it corresponds exactly. I don't take up the question of corporate power as much in this book, but it's clearly part of what we're dealing with and living with. And I don't know if you have a thought on that as well.
No,
okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
How do you feel about a wealth cap, and is there any kind of legal framework that could actually work for that?
Yeah, in Europe there's a more robust movement, libertarianism. This idea that maybe there should be an absolute 100% tax at a certain fairly high level. And that's very much in the same spirit of what I said is, if we want to save democracy, we need to, at a certain point, make the argument too much wealth undermines democracy. You know, back to the Gilded Age credo of Louis Brandeis. You can have democracy, or you can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, but you can't have both. And so it's not a discussion that has found a lot of foothold here, but you start to see people talking about this $30, $40 million level at which, you know what, that's where people start to invest in hiding their money and aggressive tax avoidance and anti-competition practices and buying media and buying senators, et cetera. So I think we could start to incubate this idea. And I'm going to turn this to Sam because Sam wrote the book, The Maximum Wage. So I'm going to bounce it to Sam to sort of a few thoughts on that.
Well, one of the ways that I think has a lot of potential that people have begun talking about is tying the top to the bottom, and to start doing that through government contracting. Not let any government contract to a corporation where the CEO makes more than 20 or 50 or 100 times what the average worker at that company makes. And then there's legislation in Congress, bills before Congress that move in that direction. And I think that's the best way we can move to start creating that link, putting that link, the idea of that link in people's minds.
Yeah, and emphasizing the gap is the harm, and if somebody wants, in Sam's scheme, you want to pay your top CEO more, raise the floor. But I also think, Ingrid Robbins' idea of, above this threshold, let's call it 30 million, there's 100% inheritance tax and a steeply progressive wealth tax that starts to chip that down. Again, this is how we're going to get more thousandaires and fewer billionaires. It has to be. But I think, I hear people say to me, it seems un-American to limit people, that sort of, well, we do that all the time. We draw some very stark lines around certain behaviors. Can't think of one of the more harmful behaviors being, paying somebody $1 trillion. How harmful is that to a wider society? So, but we need to move that discussion forward a little more than, we're not ready for prime time yet.
You've offered a lot of concepts. The question is how we win that battle. Bernie's been saying this for years. I've tried it in the state of Maryland and gotten my head handed to me, and Sam has worked with me. We tried on the 25-to-1 rule on deducting salary. Anything over 25-to-1 you can't deduct. We went nowhere. Combined reporting, the state was not willing to do. And I guess the question becomes, there's been some mass movements on environment, on housing, but there has not been a sustained movement on inequality, on taxing the rich. Bernie gets great crowds and great support for it. But in Congress, it won't even get out of committee. There are very few states that have done anything substantial. Look, we're all excited about the win in New York City, and we hope that is successful and that comes to fruition. But I guess my question to you, Chuck, and to Sam, and we've talked, is how do we turn that narrative around? We have the policies. We can talk about nuance and changing what the tax is, maximum wage, inheritance tax, whatever. But building a movement where it takes hold and starts to reverse the policies in the State House and in the Congress, when we know many of those people are bought and sold, some of my former colleagues, by the chamber, by the private sector, by capital. So I think that big challenge is the one we're all frustrated with, putting aside the Trump. This is not unique to Trump. It's a situation that's gone on for a while. And for us for we that are unhappy with capital and the concentration of capital, that battle's been a tough one. And I haven't seen a great solution anywhere in the country.
One thing I would just remind us that is in 2021, Congress came within 2 votes in the Senate of passing Build Back Better, a $3.5 trillion investment in green infrastructure, healthcare, paid for entirely by increasing taxes on multimillionaires and billionaires. You know, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, one of the advantages of wealth and power is you block things. You use your clout to block things. You find a pressure point. But the good news there is, A, that's in our muscle memory. We know what that program was. We know how close that came to being passed, to becoming a reality. That was the result of organizing and movements over the last decade. We often rendered invisible, but and the reality is that's a very popular program. It still is. Majority of Republicans know the wealthy aren't paying their fair share and support progressive taxes on the wealthy. So while I agree, I think we need to do all the things you're talking about in terms of sort of building a movement. We also have to understand we came that close, and that was the result of movements around the country and around the world. I think casting today's problems in light of this billionaire crisis is going to have currency. It already is. I think in just the last 2 years, affordability, addressing the problem by addressing concentrated wealth. And just realize we're up against powerful forces, we're up against powerful communications operations, but there's only so much you can tell people that their costs aren't going up. And that seems to be what's the current administration is trying to talk people, your problem isn't real. People don't like hearing that, And I think if it's like, your problem is real, and here's the program, and it involves these folks over here. So I think that looking for those game change, and maybe we don't have room to move at the national level in this moment, but everything we can do at the state and local levels kind of helps incubate that. And you obviously put in the time in the Maryland legislature, but I think because of the extreme nature now of both the hyper extraction of wealth from the healthy economy and how that's touching our lives. So yeah, I would start off by talking about how are you being burned by the billionaires, neighbors? How are you being touched? And here's the program. Here's where to focus our pressure points today.
Thanks, and I appreciate the focus on inequality in the U.S. and in the extreme growth. As you know, I live and work in the Congo, and where I'm confronted every day with even greater forms of inequality, both within the Congo and relative to the U.S. I'm curious if in your research you saw examples of where this extensive growth and concentration of wealth by billionaires came at the expense of a global economy and global inequality, in addition to the impact on U.S. inequality.
Yeah, this is one of my old friends who's flying back to Kinshasa tomorrow, so we're lucky we get to see each other. I obviously our work is very focused on the U.S. context, partly because we're looking at what we think are the drivers of not just U.S. inequality but global inequality. But that system of wealth hiding and of the global shell games and the tax havens is one of the subject of the book I wrote, The Wealth Hoarders, which is how billionaires spend millions to hide trillions. Well, those are global billionaires, and that is the machinery for extracting wealth, the fruits and labors and natural wealth of other places of the world and hoovering it up and out of Africa and Asia and other places. So understanding that mechanism, that extraction mechanism as a global system, but also understanding that a lot of the drivers of that are in a handful of countries. So I don't know if I can say much more except it's a global system. Huge amounts of, part of what's driving the housing crisis in this new moment is wealth extracted from around the world coming to the United States because we are now a tax haven. You know, it's not the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands. It's South Dakota and Wyoming and these states that have changed their laws to attract global billionaires to park their money here because we have a stable market and a regulated, protected market, and they can hide their money in trusts and other vehicles that are so complicated we can't even talk about them. There's the MyGo Trust, My Eyes Glaze Over Trust. You know, these are the instruments that the wealth defense industry is constructing to help the wealthy spirit money out of their host countries and move it here and to London. So yeah, that's part of our responsibility here in the U.S. is to shut down that wealth hiding apparatus here, put pressure on the tax haven states in the United States that have rewritten their laws to harbor global wealth that's been stolen from people around the world.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Yeah, we can hand it here, and then I think, yeah, this right here.
I'm curious, going back to our discussion about wealth and money in politics, how much difference do you think it would make if we could reverse Citizens United and get money out of politics?
Yeah, you know, I think Citizens United was clearly a tipping point, but there were tipping points before that and after. And, you know, I think we should try to find ways to interrupt the nexus between money and influence. But I think the way to save our democracy is to tax concentrations of wealth and power. Because money is just like a moth to the candle of influence. And it's like water running down a hill and you're trying to put up a dam and the water's going to flow around it. And so we can design all the nifty campaign finance rules and laws and regulations, and they will be subverted while there's this imbalance. So it's sort of like a chicken and egg problem that I don't have a beautiful solution to, except we're not going to fix the campaign finance reform to deal with these huge distortions to our democracy. It's about limiting the wealth and power at the top.
Hi, Chuck and Sam. It's always good to see both of you. And so many times numbers that I hear just jump off. I can't make sense of these abstract numbers. And I want to thank you, Chuck. You had mentioned over a 45-year period, if the workers in the bottom 90% would have earned an additional nearly $14,000. $14,000 per year if these gains were shared. Now, this jumps off the charts, and that wants me to do something about that. So thank you for bringing out those kind of numbers.
Yeah, and that's a Rand Corporation study that looks at if worker wages had continued to track productivity gains, worker productivity gains, how much more money would be in the pockets of workers over the last 50 years? How would we have experienced the pandemic differently if, again, we'd have a lot more thousandaires and a lot fewer billionaires. And so, yeah, you don't have to take it from me. You can see what the Rand Corporation's analysis of 50 years. But Peter Turchin, who wrote an interesting book called The End Times, here's a historian who looks at what happens to healthy societies or self-governing societies when there's too great of an imbalance of wealth and he looks over, centuries and over history. But basically, the characteristic is you immiserate the bottom, you keep wages down, and you have a wealth effect, what he calls a wealth pump, that moves wealth up to the owning classes, to the wealthy classes. And, that Rand Corporation was just looking at income, not even assets, but the amount of income each year that should have been paid to workers for their productivity gains, but instead went to capital and went to owners. And that was real money that could have been in people's pockets, that could have buoyed the middle class and lifted many people out of poverty. So, let's reverse the wealth pump. In conclusion thoughts there.
All right, let's give Chuck Collins a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Afterwards from C-SPAN. You can watch more conversations with authors like this one every Sunday on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. Book TV and all the C-SPAN networks are now available to watch live on YouTube TV. Learn more at tv.youtube.com. And next week on Afterwards, Michael Kimmel talks about his book, Playmakers, the Jewish entrepreneurs who created the toy industry in America.